so that all this information is being recorded. We have work staff here. We want to hear the input from the public, and it will all be taken into consideration. So again, thank you for being here, and I would ask that we now get on with the depositions, and Peter Rosenthal, you first. Thank you, Peter. And you know the rules almost better than anybody.
I've appeared before you before. But I hope I don't have to do it again on Tasers. I hope we convince you this time Tasers are out.
Yeah, how many times?
It's a lot to say. It's hard to say much in 5 minutes.
Stand here.
There's a lot to say. It's hard to say much in 5 minutes. I hope you read carefully your written submissions that I gave to you. It details many of the issues. I noticed that the Ontario Human Rights Commission has made a written submission too. The taser use should not be expanded at this time, and I request that you read that as well as the others. Everyone would like a safe alternative to a firearm, but such technology is not yet available. Tasers are not safe, nor are they realistic alternatives to a firearm. They're not reliable enough to be used in circumstances in which a firearm would be justified. That's why your officers are trained not to use them in such situations. Now, your discussion paper implicitly acknowledges this, stating on page 9, although not promoted as a substitute for lethal force. Well, we got the impression from the presentation so far by the police service that it was being promoted for a substitute for lethal force, but it's not. It's not promoted as a substitute for lethal force when facing an active, potentially lethal attack. It has been used as an alternative by Toronto police officers when lethal force would otherwise have been justified. In other words, any such use is contrary to training and is very rare. Your discussion paper also claims, also on page 9, that on at least 3 occasions, Toronto police officers used tasers to try to stop people who were threatening suicide. Since those rare circumstances are advanced as the justification for widening the availability of tasers, it's incumbent upon you, the Police Services Board, to restrict taser use to those situations as an alternative to a firearm or to prevent a suicide. Even if tasers might be appropriate in those rare situations, that's no reason to allow the trauma and dangers of tasering to be inflicted on people in an emotional crisis who merely threaten to assault an officer, which are a lot of the instances of taser use. Picture yourself being tasered. You see 2 darts coming at you, connected by wires to the taser. You feel the pain of the 2 darts piercing your skin, but that pain is quickly masked by the much greater pain of the huge shock as the current flows. Your muscles seize up. You are completely immobilized. You fall to the ground. How many people would you subject to such a traumatic and dangerous experience? I therefore urge you to adopt a policy that states that a Toronto police officer may only use a taser, may only fire a taser at a person if either the officer believes on reasonable grounds that it is necessary to protect against loss of life or serious bodily harm. That's the requirement for use of a firearm, as you know. Or the officer believes on reasonable grounds that it is necessary to protect against the person causing serious bodily harm to herself or himself. I notice that the Canadian Mental Health Association in its written submission supports that same position. Even with this policy in place, proper use of a taser would be much rarer than officers violating the policy. So it would be much better to simply not have any tasers. However, if taser use is to continue, such a policy must be adopted. I have copies of this proposed policy to give to you, which I shall in a moment. Now, Dr. Collins talked about de-escalation and said, someone may not respond to de-escalation. That's true. But we don't know because they don't try it. In none of the cases in which Toronto officers killed somebody was de-escalation attempted. None of them. Shame. It didn't fail in the Yateen case, it wasn't tried.
Sorry, Peter, for a minute. Let me just remind people that this is not, this is a forum where we want to hear depositions. It is not a cheering section or a comment section. Please be respectful for others. If you do not do that, I would ask you to leave. Sorry, Peter. Go ahead.
Thanks. It hasn't been tried. We look at the video of Sammy Yateen. There are officers standing around. None of them tries to talk to him. We look at the video of Michael Elegant. A bunch of officers pointing their firearms and yelling at him. Nobody tries to talk to him. In none of them did any officer try de-escalation. So, Dr. Collins, I wish there had been questions, because I would ask you, how can you possibly explain that? We don't need tasers, we need de-escalation. Tasers kill people, it's clear, and tasers often hurt people. They always at least are traumatic and somewhat painful and a horrible experience. And they're very expensive, and they've been sold very widely by Taser International, but you shouldn't fall for that gimmick once more. Thank you very much.
I know Don. I don't know why he's not here, but I know he would be strongly opposed to all use of tasers. So I'm here to talk about alternatives to the use of lethal force, not just tasers, but particularly tasers. And I'll begin by saying that Toronto police officers I know have thousands of humane interactions with people in crisis every year, and I appreciate that. The Empowerment Council I represent represents the positions of people with mental health and addictions issues. We take all of our positions from people with mental health and addiction issues. At the Voss inquest, one of the jurymen asked me if I would rather be beaten or tasered. And I said, well, whichever is least likely to cause my death, and I'm not sure we have enough research to actually say one way or the other. At the time, my organization thought, well, better to be tasered than to be shot. So we prefer tasers than bullets, so we support it as an alternative to lethal force, but only as an alternative to lethal force. But as the research has emerged, it seems that that's not the way tasers are used. If someone has a weapon, tasers are not reliable enough for officers to use if they feel someone's coming at them with a weapon. So it's really not used as an alternative to lethal force. It is, however, used disproportionately against the community of people who have mental health issues. I'm sympathetic to officers who confront people that other people run away from, but CEWs are not an alternative to lethal force. Inquests that recommend tasers in Ontario have never, to my knowledge, had a really fulsome discussion about tasers at the inquests. Because, as Peter pointed out, tasers are not attempted to be used at, I think you might have pointed this out, attempted to be used when people have been shot. They therefore have not been considered the facts of the case, so we really have never been allowed to discuss them very fully. I'd also like to mention that showing a taser is not de-escalation. It's not conversation. It's traumatizing. Most people who have mental health and addiction issues are survivors of trauma, and the threat of being utterly helpless is quite terrifying. It seems quite ironic, I must say, to use it as an alternative to self-harm. So I know that we all agree that de-escalation would be the best course of action, and de-escalation needs time. So time requires sometimes that if someone has a weapon, they need to be contained. There needs to be some kind of defense that allows an officer to take the time to have the conversation for someone to de-escalate. So to me, this means a lot more emphasis on helmets and shields and vests, and not so much on methods of aggression. Anything that can gain time and even containment is helpful. Shields can also be used to actively disarm people. Most likely they would take more than one officer. I think that the idea that shields would create a psychological barrier to talking to people is significantly less problematic than the barrier that guns pose to talking to people. If a command to drop a weapon doesn't work when a person's in crisis, try something else, like what's going on, is there something I can do to help, as long as you have the time and containment to do that. And I have to acknowledge that when there's a weapon involved and somebody's moving fast, conversation might not always work. So as a very last resort, I think the stock round is better than bullets and can be used as a distance, unlike tasers. Some might actually stop a person. I live in dread of my saying this and have someone getting shot in the face with a sock round, but still, better sock round than a bullet. I think we can agree that the best solutions are upstream, that having adequate crisis support so police are not even called would really be the ideal solution. But I also want to mention to well-meaning people who say that the solution is to keep more people in psychiatric institutions or to make sure that everyone's drugged so they're never aggressive. That not everyone in crisis is in crisis all the time. That people with mental health issues are only occasionally in crisis, and anyone can be at crisis at some point in their lives. So we all need a good response to any of our situations of grief and loss and things that drive people to crisis.
Senator, thank you.
Now you can start. So it's been a few nights since you've slept, maybe more than a few. Your mind is sparking with lights and new thoughts, brilliant discoveries, cures for what ails the world. But perking through our real fears, they will try and stop you, turn out the lights, put you back there. You hear them talking about you, warning each other about you, so you break out, run across the street, immune to cars and horns, still listening to them defame you. Sirens break into your head, the noise louder and louder and threatening, and you want to run faster. You feel you should be able to win gold with your sprinting, but there, cutting you off, are a couple of uniforms. You turn back, more uniforms behind you. You can't let them confine you. You are so close to something more real than them. They are yelling, but drowned out by your own voices. Yelling, yelling. You turn towards them, walk towards them to tell them to stop shouting, and then, one, you're hit by something very hard. Red covers your blouse. Confused, you fall to your knees. Then your face breaks on the pavement. Person refused to stop when ordered. Presented a threat to officers. You're hit by prongs that dig through your clothing, and then your system goes haywire. Your heart, already beating way too fast, already erratic, seems to burst, and you fall. Tasers a contributing factor to death is the verdict of the coroner. 3, one of the uniforms smiles at you, waving the others away. He says his name, his first name, you think. And then, having a bad day? How can I help? It stops your forward movement, it puzzles you, confuses you, but you want to listen because this is all very scary, and suddenly you're feeling really tired, and you answer, I need some sleep. And speaking together, he and you find a way out. 0 deaths. Though this board has gone a long way under you, Andy, and done much, and it's time to address long-standing issues, and has shown courage and readiness to deal with the burgeoning police budget and problems, it is falling short when it comes to the responsibility towards the vulnerable. Motives are complex. We state our strong desire to save lives, and I don't question that, but it is not the only imperative at play. 18 inquests in 12 years, the time and expense involved, the tarnished reputation of the service, and list of demands from juries also impinge on decision making. We have a responsibility to listen to the weakest of voices, those unaccompanied by experts and statistics and charts and assurances, for it is we who are being asked to bear the consequences of the failure of the service to embed, implement, prioritize, and most of all, hold accountable those who break their training. And if we have been unable to enforce training in de-escalation, assurances that training in CEWs and the invocation of the SIU as guarantor are laughable. However much the service and the board concentrate on the potential of CEWs to save lives, in our communities, statistics pale before the vision of Samuel Ting being tasered while dying, and the months-long justification of that action by senior officers tells us that we have no real protection from abuse when it's not even recognized as such by those who perpetrate it. The expansion of CEWs is nothing less than an admission that those enduring the symptoms of mental illness need protection from those who are supposed to provide it. It will spell the end of the good efforts of many people, to teach and demonstrate the value and effectiveness of de-escalation. Expediency rationale, some of which we've heard tonight, will rule the day. The psychological as well as physical harm to the individual and to the communities of lived experience who already struggle with prejudice and false beliefs about mental illness will be profoundly harmed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
5 minutes.
Chairman Pringle, board members, members of the public. On a summer night in July 2013, police Toronto Police Services officer James Fursillo was the first officer on the scene, responding to a call regarding an 18-year-old boy named Sammy Yatim, who was alone on a stopped streetcar on Dundas Street West. Within seconds, Officer Fursillo shot Sammy 3 times from close range. 5.5 seconds later, as Sammy lay dying on the floor of the streetcar, Officer Fursillo shot again, 6 more times. 50 seconds after the first volley of shots, Sergeant Pravica arrived at the scene, pulling out his taser as he was putting his cruiser into park. He tasered Sammy in the chest twice. The public was outraged. Sergeant Pravica tasered Sammy because other officers had called for an officer with a taser. There were already about a dozen officers on scene, and Sammy had been shot multiple times and was breathing his last few breaths when Sergeant Pravica got out of his police cruiser. Ontario's chief forensic pathologist, Dr. Palanen, determined that Sammy was already dead when he was tasered. Dr. Palanen so concluded because there was no blood on the inside of the taser barbs, indicating that Sammy's heart had stopped beating. The Toronto Police Services has an early intervention process aimed at identifying officers who may be at risk of entering the disciplinary process. An officer who points his Glock semi-automatic pistol at a person 3 times within a rolling 12-month period is the trigger for the TPS early intervention to kick in and issue an alert. Officer Fursillo was red flagged because in his short career as a police officer, he had pulled his gun an inordinate number of times. Officer Fursillo pulled his gun 12 times. 12 times in 3.5 years on the job. It is unclear what happened with the disciplinary process for Officer Fursillo after the first alert was issued in 2012. If the Toronto Police Services could not heed the red flag with Officer Fursillo, how can they possibly monitor the use of tasers by all officers? Sammy Yatim was laying on the ground, motionless, dying, yet he was tasered twice. Is that good policing? And consideration is being given to providing every frontline officer with a taser?
That's nuts.
Would we not expect Sergeant Pravica to pause and assess, take the time, as was mentioned earlier, assess the situation, maybe ask a question or two of other officers before he used his taser? What happened to common sense and judgment? What guidelines were enforced regarding the use of a taser? What additional training have officers undergone since? What lessons have we learned? Tasers are dangerous. The manufacturer's safety warnings say so. They clearly say on all tasers, quote, can cause death or serious injury. In the United States, officers carrying both the gun and a taser have mistakenly reached for the wrong weapon. Before you consider expanding the use of tasers, consider the root problem. The problem lies with police training and retraining, identifying and weeding out bad cops. That's where money and resources should be spent, not on buying more tasers and putting them in the hands of bad cops. Deputy Chief Federico has testified in court about proper de-escalation techniques. De-escalation has to be the emphasis. Mr. Ron Bain, our first speaker today, the executive director of the Ontario Chiefs of Police said, quote, verbal de-escalation is the primary goal. Police officers need to be properly trained and retrained on de-escalation techniques. They do not need another weapon. Please devote the time, care, and attention where it belongs in training and in de-escalation. As Dr. Collins said today, De-escalation is the goal. Don't throw more money at buying more tasers. Do the right thing. Spend it where many have recommended on teaching de-escalation. From the very outset, the Yateem family has indicated that they have 3 goals in the aftermath of
Thank you
Sandy's.
very much.
Well, you know what?
I'm sorry.
Okay, but there was a guideline for the first speakers too, and they spoke longer.
Yeah,
They
let him
did not.
speak. Let
They
him
did.
speak. Let
Okay,
him
I
speak.
made a record. The first one was longer.
Wrap up, sir.
I will wrap up, but you know, it should be fair.
Yeah, it should be fair.
From the very outset, the Yateem family has indicated that they have 3 goals in the aftermath of Sammy's death. First, determine what happened. Second, hold those responsible accountable for their action. And third, do whatever is possible so that such a tragedy is not repeated. No other family should have to endure such a tragedy. For Sammy's sake, do the right thing. Thank you for
My name is Nigel Barriffe. I'm an elementary school teacher here in the city, and I'm also president of the Urban Alliance on Race Relations. The Urban Alliance on Race Relations has been working on civilian police oversight since 1975. At that time, after racially motivated incidences of assault on our subway platforms, the police told the public that they could not do anything about such assaults. It was citizen action that eventually forced the needed changes. It is clear to those of us new to activism, and those of us who have been involved in activism for a long time, that there are police shootings of citizens. They are mostly of racialized people who are often in crisis. We all have the right to better policing. This means more discretion in deploying weapons, more evidence that de-escalation training is being used in community policing, and more representation of diversity on the Toronto Police Force itself. Public consultations for the past few years, or for all, every time we continue to keep coming to see you, is an opportunity for police services to listen to the legitimate complaints and fears of people, especially those of us who are marginalized and more vulnerable due to our race, poverty, and disability. All citizens are united in supporting our right to walk the streets, to gather for rallies, and marching for political change. These are rights that need to be protected by police. We do not need to fear the police who carry tasers in those situations. It is our view that the proposal to arm police with tasers runs counter to what's required for safer communities and better police relations with the public that they serve. This move escalates the possibility of inappropriate use of force, employing technology that past experience has shown can be used as inappropriately as any other weapon. The sales of these technologies primarily benefit the companies that make them. In a context where many community groups have been asking for de-escalation of police, the police proposal for these tasers should be rejected.
Yes.
And what makes this meeting and discussion most egregious is that we're using the death of Andrew Loku to purchase millions of dollars of lethal hardware. Why is the attention continually on tasers as opposed to things like the mobile crisis teams, or as opposed to the de-escalation techniques that we all are talking about? If the police want to gain the confidence of all citizens who are here, who they are to serve and protect, they need to demonstrate that they will be able to better assess and de-escalate situations rather than react to them with indiscriminate use of weapons. Toronto Police Services need to rise to the challenge of higher standards and become more accountable to the people they serve through rigorous civilian oversight.
Yes.
We do not need to squander this opportunity to gain the respect of those of us who dare to be part of the democratic process. Thank you very much.
We've certainly talked about this before, and the question of bringing on tasers. I said previously that I certainly support the idea of having de-escalation options available for the officers. We can certainly see where there are cases where they need that. The problem is that we also see the reality of what's gone on in Toronto, and we've seen situations like in 2011, a supervisor that you entrusted with a taser was found with footage, or they found footage in the vehicle of that officer, supervisor, threatening to tase a handcuffed suspect in the groin and in the neck. He was, of course, found to have not eaten lunch that day, and so it was okay. And I hope at some point the chief is looking after making sure that his employees eat properly so that we can feel safe with them. You'll remember in 2015, in October, the board approved purchase of 522 tasers. At that point, you decided to purchase tasers without cameras because you had body-worn video coming into play. And yet here we are, more than coming up on a year and a half later now. You've approved $500,000 for the chief to give you information on putting body-worn cameras out there, and we still haven't heard anything back. We are, however, in a big push to get these tasers out there. Meanwhile, as I brought up the last time we had the report on tasers last fall, there was a dramatic increase, I think threefold, in the number of times that we had guards using them, and presumably in display force mode, basically threatening to shock people and electrocute them. And that is the problem, that the community is afraid of their police and having the Toronto police treating them that way. And so we certainly require some protection of having video available, whether it's spending the excess money on purchasing tasers that have video and that can record that, or whether it's putting the push in to have body-worn cameras available. I think the problem is that the community doesn't trust its police in every situation. There are good police, we all know that. The problem is there are too many bad ones. And that is what we expect you folks to be taking care of. And it's certainly a challenging issue, but to have us talking about this matter now, whereas we're not talking about all the follow-up and enforcement of making sure that police are held accountable, that when there is a problem, that they are properly punished, that it doesn't end up being a slap on the wrist, that it isn't, oh, well, you're losing 30 days of your banked holiday pay, you're going to get a slightly smaller paycheck in 6 months, but don't do it again. That is not acceptable overall in our society. It falls to this board to deal with these situations. You are all we've got to protect us having to deal with police directly. And when our only choice is to rely on you, when you're not meeting those requirements for us, that's disturbing and problematic. So I hope you'll listen to all the people here that are telling you that we're concerned about having our police officers out there with tasers without some protection for us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Nabil Yatim said, if police officers in Ontario received more training on how to use words instead of weapons, my son would be alive today. Yeah. That's from an article that Wendy Gillis wrote on June 21st, 2016. I hope that you would read that article because it identifies some issues that the public is raising today. There is also an article referring to Mr. McIsaac, and I think you may have mentioned one of his relatives. I'm not sure if they're related or not. But he too, there were recommendations, 31 in fact, about his matter. When you speak about recommendations, it's interesting that the police are strong in presenting portions of the recommendations, but not referring to all recommendations. So you may say, let's just use a general figure that you used here. 11 out of 18 recommendations say purchase or provide conducted energy weapons, whereas all recommendations say employ de-escalation tactics. The problem is that the police misunderstand what de-escalation means. For some reason, they see de-escalation as using some sort of weapon. And the public sees de-escalation as it rightfully is using words to reduce the issues that are affecting people or the crisis situation, to calm things down instead of aggravating things, which the police often do. I think Chris mentioned about the trust in the police. You're expecting us to trust the police to do the right thing. On September 21st, 2017, at the police headquarters, I was unnecessarily assaulted. Unnecessary force was used against my body that included sexual assault. And I am told that that officer is still on active duty. So it is a concern to me that if we're expecting to trust the police to do the right thing, but yet they can't even do the right thing on such basic things as letting someone use an elevator at police headquarters, why would we think that they would be doing the right thing and using tasers? Deputy Chief Barbara McLean mentioned that the police must use the least amount of force necessary. The problem is all the police are trained with is primarily force. And if you're not training them in the ability to use de-escalation strengths, then you're never going to change that. We have already disputed on these issues before. The police have made their presentations before. What has changed today? Nothing has changed since. And we haven't changed our position, and the police haven't done anything to improve their de-escalation training. Specifically in your report here on your paper, you refer to on page 4 of 13, it refers to page 101 of a report done by the Critical Issues in Policing Series Guiding Principles on Use of Force 2016. In that report, you refer to some things there, but again, you don't highlight what the rest of that report speaks to on page 102, where it's not, again, using tasers, it's using de-escalation tools. England and Scotland do it all the time, and this is where that training principle comes from. So I'm saying, why aren't we employing those skills? Until you can increase that strength, then we can't approve as a society of people fearful of our own lives. I'm fearful of being around the police. I was fearful of coming here today, and that shouldn't have occurred. And that's the position that most people take when dealing with the police. The psychiatrist, Mr. Peter Collins, identified talk, time, and tactics. The problem that's missing from police training, at least in our observation, is talk and time. And we all know that when you use a taser, or at least in reports, medical reports have indicated, and the psychiatrist should know this, that when there's drug-induced, he mentioned people are hopped up on drugs, when drugs are involved or someone has a heart condition, you're more likely prone to death by using a taser. There was a mention that there's no series of deaths. We know deaths in Ontario. We have the case of Aaron Furman. He's in Ontario. The coroner reported that his death was as a result of a taser. Rui Nabiko in the city of Toronto, ruling was death by taser. Robert Tazansky in Vancouver, ruling was death by taser. And the reality is that there isn't enough studies to show that tasers are safe, but there are studies to show the likelihood of death when tasers are used. It's the simple education that we learn in elementary school. Do not stick your finger in the socket. And especially when your finger is wet. Our bodies comprise of about 67% of water. So think about the force of 50,000 volts triggering somebody's body and what that does. As Mr. Rosenthal has already said, you seize up and you fall. You can die of concussion. You can hit your head on something. All of these factors are not safe factors. I want to wrap it up by saying that the board has in its mandate, it says the board is responsible for the provision of adequate and effective police services. And I think I've already agreed with what this gentleman here, I'm sorry I forgot. Mr. Eubanez has already said, and Mr. Barriffe has said, and also Chris has stated. The fact is that the Police Services Board has a responsibility to the public to ensure adequate and effective police services. It's not to ensure more weaponry for the police. We're wanting to decrease the ability of police to use weapons and to increase their use of words. Words mean something and it counts for something in de-escalation. Thank you.
I just want to say, by me speaking at this meeting, this shall not be deemed to be by consent in any way expressed or implied, and doing so is fraud. God bless Her Majesty the Queen, and long live Her Majesty the Queen. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge and accept the oath of all the fine, upstanding common law constable peace officers in attendance today that they took to uphold the Constitution. Somehow, some way, Chair Pringle, you are still not on Twitter, but fortunately, I am. And just before I logged off to come down here today, I printed off a tweet. Apparently the UN Human Rights have a Twitter account. And what they had to say was, arbitrary violence by police can amount to torture, even when it takes place outside prison walls, UN expert warns. There's also another tweet that I came across in regards to tonight. It was in response to someone named Hamlin Grange. He asked the question, should cops carry tasers? Public to weigh in at the board meeting, an article from the Star. And just some guy commented on Twitter that police think they can use this toy to shoot people without killing them and stay out of trouble. Tell them to use brains and communication. In case anyone's interested in who this guy was, his name is Alok Mukherjee, who was just the former, he was a sheriff before you were sheriff. So I don't know if anyone's ever heard of a lady named Sandra Bland. I have an article here from the New York Times by David Montgomery. Texas trooper who arrested Sandra Bland is charged with perjury. The trooper wrote that he removed Ms. Bland from her car to more safely conduct the traffic investigation, but the grand jury found that statement to be false, a special prosecutor, Sean McDonald, said. A police dashboard camera video of the episode shows an escalating confrontation after Ms. Bland refuses Trooper Encinia's request to put out a cigarette. At one point, Trooper Encinia says he will forcibly remove Ms. Bland from her car and threatens her with, wait for it, a taser, saying, I will light you up. Now, it would be great to be able to have the other side of the story from Sandra Bland about what happened. Unfortunately, she's dead. She somehow committed suicide, hanging herself in her jail cell 3 days after this happened. And as I recall, she was on her way back from getting a job from her alma mater in Texas. And I'm not quite sure why you would commit suicide over a traffic offense. So this is the flip side to tasers, because I've had a number of not standoffs with police, but discussions with police about what the law actually is. And so it's not so much tasers I have a problem with, more than who exactly will be using them. Like, there's going to be 80 more police officers hired, right? Are you guys going to make sure that they're good common law constable peace officers who took an oath to uphold the Constitution, or will 80 dumb thugs who like to fight and just hurt people for no good reason be hired? Like, that's on you, and that's on the police to make sure that responsible people are hired, because we're stuck paying for these guys, right?
Yep.
I just also wanted to mention that in this report, the words accountability and transparency are used a lot. In Black's Law 9th Dictionary, accountability is defined as responsible, answerable. The company is held accountable for the employee's negligence. Transparency is defined as openness, clarity, lack of guile, and attempts to hide damaging information. The word is used of financial disclosures, organizational policies and practices, lawmaking, and other activities where organizations interact with the public. 1 minute. Because I think it was Deputy Chief Barbara McLean, I don't know if she put that all together, but I recall something about civilian authority and will of the public, the police serve. And I gotta be blunt with you guys. I don't know, like, it's one thing to say that you're accountable and transparent. It's actually another thing to actually be transparent. And we've had this before, Chair Pringle, that I, with all respect to Deputy Chief McLean, this is a board that doesn't even allow us to ask questions.
Yeah.
So, like, you guys can say you think that you're transparent as much as you want, but until we are able to ask questions of a material fact, that are relevant, like, so I don't buy the whole openness and transparency and accountability, so.
Thank you, Gary.
Thank you, Darren.
Thanks very much. I'm going to speak against the expanded distribution of conducted energy weapons within the police service. I'll be using some of my research on this decision. Now, the admirable goal of zero harm and zero death is great. But seeing tasers or conducted energy weapons as part of that strategy is a problem. They're weapons. They're weapons that can cause harm and death, and we have to reject their expanded adoption and use. I'm going to give 3 reasons. First, around that evidence suggests that adoption of tasers does not result in the reduced lethal force incidents. Second is that tasers' business and marketing strategy makes it very difficult to evaluate the weapon clearly. Many studies on this matter are tainted by tasers' involvement, sponsorship, and influence. And third, that Taser or Axon International's shifting position on the risks posed by tasers to broad sectors of society, especially those with mental illness and racialized communities, is really worrying and cause for concern. Now, I know that this conversation has been going on for a long time, and tasers have been widely adopted by many police forces, often on the heels of some sort of high-profile shooting, an injury, an inquiry, and lawsuit, at the moments when passions are high and a solution is demanded by the broader public. It's at those moments that Taser steps in and says, this is your solution. I'm really glad that Toronto has been cautious on this front, and I'm glad that oversight bodies and movements and ordinary people have refused to simply get on the bandwagon. I'm also glad to be able to talk about it today, just at the moment when most police forces have them, and some of them are starting to restrict and reduce their use. So I think there's a turning point here. Tasers are not a way to get to zero harm, zero death. We know there is the Reuters report, I'm sure you've read, in the US, 1,005 people who've died in the US following encounters with police in which tasers were used or part of a larger mosaic of force. In at least 153 cases, Reuters found that coroners or medical examiners cited the taser as the cause or contributing factor in the death. And yet we continue to hear that tasers save lives, that it reduces gun shooting. As you know, the statistics from 2007 that Canadian Press obtained and the CBC reported, the number of shootings remains consistent in cities that have recently adopted tasers. And so you get actually an increase of injury and death rather than the alternative. And despite the notion that tasers will reduce police shootings, Axon International's VP of Strategic Communications, Steve Tuttle, even notes, tasers aren't a replacement for deadly force. In fact, there's research that suggests that bringing a taser into a situation can escalate crisis and confrontation rather than reduce it. The second reason that we need to be wary about expanding the distribution of them is the way that profit motives are shaping the adoption of the weapon. As we know, the less lethal weapons market is absolutely enormous, and Taser Axon blurs the lines between its corporate interests, police affairs, and scientific research, often enmeshing itself in investigations when its tools might be implicated in the deaths. Not tools, weapons. Let's call them what they are. Okay. The last thing I really want to kind of pay attention to is the way that the company has backed away from its claims that tasers are a non-lethal weapon, right? They're not calling it a non-lethal weapon anymore. And as the deaths and lawsuits have piled up, Taser has adopted a new risk management strategy, 2009, and added warnings to the weapons. But the warnings are not trickling down to the average police officer. Whereas originally it was said that it was a flexible and multi-purpose tool, now the company says, don't use it on the chest area, don't use it for repeated or prolonged exposure if there's cardiac risks, and they shouldn't be used against those who are old, young, frail, agitated, exhausted, or suffering from mental or physical health conditions, basically protecting themselves from lawsuit. This leaves a very tiny window and not a very useful tool. Evidence suggests, of course, that this tool gets used against marginalized and vulnerable populations. We know that the research in Toronto, that nearly half the incidents in which police used a taser in 2015 involved an emotionally disturbed person. And this is particularly worrisome when we know that emotionally disturbed people and those who have drugs in their system are more likely to get more shocks. These 3 reasons, I think, are giving some police agencies pause. In response to a ruling in the US that erratic behavior and mental illness should not trigger taser use, agencies are reducing their use. In Baltimore, They use tasers, the police use tasers 47% less in 2016 than in 2015, and tasers are being used less, between 60 and 95% less in 2016 in cities in Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and West Virginia. Boston's police chief from 2006 to 2013 explains the increasing restrictions help him to decide not to issue tasers. I think we need to follow this trend. Thank you.
I'm dismayed to see that amongst all the recommendations put forward by the jury at the inquest into the murder of Andrew Loku, several of which have been recommended to the Toronto Police Service many times before, that the one that received the most enthusiasm was to arm our officers with additional weapons. Aside from the financial cost being exorbitant, the cost to the safety of vulnerable cities in Toronto, citizens in Toronto, including citizens who are already unfairly targeted by Toronto police officers, fills me with dread. I will reiterate, like others have today, that an officer was present with a taser when Constable James Forcillo murdered Sammy Yatim. This was after Forcillo fired 9 shots, and 30 seconds after that he was tased by Sergeant Dan Pravica. I can't imagine what the use for this less lethal weapon was, except to maybe make sure Sammy Yatim was dead. By placing our focus on weapons, we divorce them from the officers that are deploying them. Andrew Loku did not die because Andrew Doyle did not have access to a taser. Andrew Loku died because Andrew Doyle made 0 attempt at de-escalation, because he was ignorant to the perspectives and lived experiences of racialized communities and individuals with mental health issues, and because of systemic anti-Black racism within our city and its institutions. Andrew Loku died because Andrew Doyle was driven by fear and not compassion, and was empowered to act on that fear. So in short, I believe arming more officers with tasers is an insult to the memory of Sammy Yatim and Andrew Loku. And it's so obviously counterproductive to the TPS's stated goal of 0 harm and 0 death that I feel it's an insult to the entire city of Toronto. I urge the police force to look at the other recommendations made by the jury at the inquest into the death of Andrew Loku, specifically exposing officers and training to the perspective and lived experiences of racialized communities and individuals with mental health issues and addiction issues, amending the annual use of force recertification to include qualification in areas including mental health, anti-racism, and particularly anti-Black racism, and a continued emphasis on alternative methods of communication and de-escalation when an individual does not comply with the police challenge. After the G20, after Sammy Yatim, after Andrew Loku, after DeFonte Miller, after watching Dion Renee depute at the last police force meeting, bleeding from her mouth and holding ice to her face, you can understand why I believe that the stated goal of 0 harm, 0 and 0 death feels like lip service. Thank you. Woo-hoo! So, as indicated by several speakers, Andrew Loku died within approximately 21 seconds of police entering the vicinity. And it appears that the training of talk and time were not applied. So why should we rely on police to apply their training of talk and time when we have time and time again the example that that has not been applied? What we want to see is an increase of anti-Black racism training, so to look at that within the policing services, to recognize and acknowledge that racism does exist, and it actually motivates some people to act in a particular way towards people of color because of their racist bias. We want to see the increase in de-escalation training, that is, again, the use of words and training, and in increasing mobile crisis units. And we also want to know that once we apply money to those things, then maybe we can come back after it's been demonstrated that these things can be effectively applied, where the police service board acknowledges or proves to the public that adequate and effective police services has been demonstrated through these methods, then maybe we can have another discussion. But right now, that discussion about conducted energy weapons is not on the table for us as the public. Scout has written, "Dear Toronto Police Service Board, I am writing to express my displeasure that the Toronto Police Services Board is considering the use of conducted energy weapons in response to recommendations by the coroner's inquest into Andrew Loku's death by Toronto officer Andrew Doyle. The implementation of conducted energy weapons, CEWs, are not the route to take in order to combat the overwhelming anti-black racism and overt bias that is systemic within the Toronto Police Service and which led to the death of Andrew Loku by police. We do not know that having Andrew Loku be armed with a taser would have saved Andrew Loku's life, because Andrew Doyle saw Mr. Loku as a threat from the second he entered Mr. Loku's home, and 21 seconds later, he was dead. This board has consistently contributed to the ongoing arming and militarization of the Toronto Police Service, the budget of which now exceeds $1 billion. The use of less lethal force or less lethal weapons, as in quotes, will allow, because that doesn't even make sense, less lethal, it just doesn't even make sense, will allow police officers, and the not make sense part is my contribution, it wasn't Scout's writing, will allow police officers to utilize these weapons under the guise of avoiding harm or potentially fatal blows. However, we know that the police are also prone to use their weapons in excess, as seen in the case of Sammy Yateen and in other highly publicized cases, to, quote again, neutralize a threat. The reality is that prolonged exposure to CEWs as an excessive use can increase the risk of heart failure in those it is used against. The report accompanying this meeting outlines all the bodily harm that CEWs can do. The Toronto Police have not demonstrated that they have the awareness or ability to minimize their use of force when dealing with members of the public who are racialized, have mental health issues, and disabilities. Therefore, we cannot be assured that the police will use their new weapon responsibly and without excess, as the Toronto Police claim to see a danger wherever it suits them to justify their excessive violence. The Toronto Police do not know how to interact with Black people, Indigenous people, racialized people, people with disabilities, people with addictions, and queer and trans people. The Toronto Police Services Board had not acknowledged the other recommendations that were put forward by the inquest into Andrew Loku's death. Training to combat the institutionalized anti-Black racism in this service. Training for de-escalation beyond a measly 3 weeks. Training in communication, in non-violent approaches to conflict resolution. This should be the focus and mandate of this board. This board has no accountability to the public. I urge this board to not implement the use of conducted energy weapons and instead focus on the implementation of training to combat anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, and other forms of racism, conscious and unconscious bias for all frontline officers, de-escalation training, and non-violent conflict resolution techniques. The most dangerous people in many interactions with the public are the police officers themselves. We do not need them armed with more weaponry. Thank you from Scout Schwartz. And just lastly, just to end for the last few seconds, it's the idea that the Police Services Board has a responsibility to the public. The Police Services Board has a responsibility to ensure that the officers are trained, and quite frankly, ultimately, when it comes down to litigation, it's the Police Services Board and the public paying for the improper application of, quote, what is said to be the training that we don't necessarily see firsthand.
Thank you, John.
Unfortunately, John and Marco couldn't make it.
Okay, well, thank you for being here, and you have 5 minutes. I'll give you a 1-minute warning.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
The briefing paper submitted by the police service for this meeting states that Justice Nicovici's in his July 2014 report recommends some conditions, or with some conditions, expanding CEWs and body cameras. deployment in the Toronto Police Services to more frontline police officers, recommendation number 59. That is not what he recommended. Recommendation 59 states the TPS, Toronto Police Service, consider conducting a pilot project to assess the potential for expanding CEW access within the service. And he lays out detailed parameters about how that project might proceed. We are not aware of any pilot project carried out by the Toronto Police Service which satisfies recommendation 59. The police service retained Mr. Ikabuchi in 2013 to report on how police might best manage encounters with people in crisis. This is a report that the police service requested, and it makes sense to assume that the police service would then follow the recommendations or indicate clearly why they would be ignored. In all, Mr. Ikabuchi made 16 recommendations relating to CEWs, numbers 55 through 71, and they are available in the written brief that we sent. The recommendations seek good evidence about the use of CEWs, deal with police monitoring and training, as well as discipline. They are a comprehensive set of proposals, and as far as we know, the Toronto Police Service has acted on very few of them. What's needed is a report from the police service about each recommendation and how it has been dealt with, as well as a time frame for addressing those recommendations which have not yet been implemented. Until that is done, no further consideration should be given to purchasing more CEWs. The police service should heed the advice it sought 3 years ago before proceeding further. TPAC believes that CEWs should be curtailed, not expanded, for several reasons. There is no doubt that our CEWs lead to injury and death and are used on vulnerable people in crisis who are most likely to experience adverse consequences from the application of electric current to their bodies. We know that there are viable de-escalation alternatives that the police can use and that are used by other professionals who work with people in crisis, such as talking and using mental health teams as first responders, which we believe should be expanded. Evidence from police departments across North America is that more CEWs lead to more shootings and undermine efforts to increase the use of de-escalation techniques. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
One of the guys who came to the, members of the public who came for the first consultation on CEWs, and tonight I am very happy to see members of the community tonight. I thought that there was going to be someone screaming by the door and ask us to empty our pockets. I was really afraid tonight, but it didn't happen.
Yeah.
And I'm so glad to see many people tonight. Compared to last 2 weeks meetings at police headquarters, it was minimal, maybe 3, 4, and what happened to the ring is not acceptable. Unacceptable behavior by the members of the police. I want to say something. You remember the day I brought a plastic shield to the board in my presentation in the benefit of having this type of resource available for Toronto Police Services. I wonder if you are including in this proposal to ask the members of the community, because you seem to achieve a higher goal of reducing harm and zero deaths. Well, I really hope that the recommendations that all the public has made today really make sound in your ears, because we have time and time again trying to let you know how desperate we are, how afraid we are of you officers. And tonight, one word resounded in my mind tonight, the word how are we going to protect ourselves from the Toronto police officers? So I have a great idea. So here's a vest. Now if I put the vest on, I'm sure I will be protected from a police officer who has been disciplined time and time again, and who has been told, you know what, you should be wasting your time coming to become a police officer. So this is the only weapon that can protect us from police officers who have weapons to their discretion. And that's all I want to conclude by saying that this is a great way to engage the community in a public space, away from the bunker that has become the Toronto Police Headquarters. Thank you.
Deborah Wigan. Is Deborah Wigan here from LAMP? Okay. Matthew St. Jean. No. And then Desmond Cole. No. That then wraps up the list of speakers that we had. I want to thank everybody who either sent in a deposition or who took the time to come tonight to speak to us for being here. As I've said, the process is very similar to what it was last time. We wanted to take public consultation. We wanted the service to present their point of view. It also reminds the public of what the service is asking the board. The board will now take all this information into discussion, and it will be discussed in public at a future board meeting. It could be as early as November, but it could also be early in the new year. As I pointed out, while the board has set aside in its budget, not the board, but the service has set aside in its budget an appropriation for the potential of tasers, that in no way means that it will happen. It's merely a fact that if we go ahead with a process like this and it does get approved, you then can't say, well, we don't have the money for it. So that, again, just as I was saying to Peter earlier, it was actually in last year's budget, the current year's budget, just in that situation. So it is really very much an active discussion for the board. Again, I want to thank the public because it's very important, particularly those people who brought something written that can be, because we have 4 board members here. We're still 3 could not make it because of other commitments and responsibilities, and so we will make sure that the staff, which is there sitting right behind Dion, have taken notes and that it gets on to the other board members. And if anybody that gave a deposition that has a written and hasn't given it to us, if they would could do so, that would be additionally helpful. But again, I want to thank everybody for their engagement this evening, and that this is an active discussion. The one other thing I think that's mentioned a couple of times is about the other recommendations coming out of the Andrew Loco inquest. As you know, and the board was very active through its counsel in that discussion, because we wanted to get those recommendations, as many recommendations as we could coming forward. It was commented a couple of times we haven't acted on them yet. It's because we are still in research about it, but I think it's fair to say that when they do come forward, probably again at the November board meeting, the board is very disposed to implement all of them. It's not to prejudge where we're going, but it's to say we were very active in that inquest and wanted to get as much information as we could. So I will just say that, again, in closing off, I want to thank everybody for being here. I want to thank you for taking the time to give us the information as you did 4 years ago. And it is now up to my colleagues and the board and the staff to sit down and to bring this back into their discussion in the public forum. Before I close off, I'd ask any of my board colleagues if they have anything that they wish to add.
Can I make an observation?
Yep.
So I do want to thank the community members in particular for coming forward this evening, and I wanted to make sure that I understand that the documents that are presented today would be available to people who weren't able to attend tonight. So I know that we haven't mastered the art of putting everything online, but I'm making that observation because a lot of time and energy was put into a number of the deputations. Those of you who did not provide written deputations, you can always send us something going forward, but we will make every effort to capture what was said today and to make available the actual documents that were presented at this meeting.
Okay. With that, thank you again for coming, and the meeting is adjourned.